Welcome everyone to the Great Lakes Permaculture Design Collaborative.
We are a trio of permaculturists.
Rhonda Baird from Bloomington, Indiana.
William Faith from Chicago, Illinois.
Milton Dixon from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
We're teaming up to create a hands-on learning experience
that can catapult you into a regenerative practice of your own.
glpdc.info
will send you to the host of our next Permaculture Design Certificate course.
So welcome everybody. Today we're talking about the local ecosystem. To provide some continuity through these recordings, we're using the permaculture flower as a navigational compass. This specific topic, the local ecosystem, really does relate to all the petals. You might think that it really is just land and nature stewardship, but every single petal, there's some sort of infrastructure or something there already. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about the local ecosystem. Looking around us and seeing what are we working with, what exists out in the world. The first thing I'd like everyone to understand is how we can benefit from understanding ecology. And it really is by working with the forces around us instead of battling against them, we can conserve our energy for making the changes we ultimately want. This particular picture is a path. It's not a perfectly straight line. It kind of zigs and zags around a little bit because there were existing trees there. It's going around them.
What I see in this picture is a disturbed ecosystem that's reorganizing itself. And so plants, probably animals, although we don't see them, are taking advantage of the opportunities in this ecosystem to live their lives, reproduce, live abundantly. And so we want to become savvy to what is actually going on in the scene.
I'd say even the pathway itself, if you look at it, is taking into consideration some of what's there. It's working with it a little bit. You'll notice it's a bit curved. It's not a big straight path. Nature never works in straight lines, so it's kind of taking that into consideration. That should be a part of your observation as well.
Mm-hmm. And I'm noticing that it's dipped down, so that means probably there's softer soils, right? It's worn down over time.
Or it's been tread upon.
Or it's been tread upon.
The lack of vegetation there points to that. So this next slide, really the thing that we have to realize is that we're entering into a relationship with what exists around us. In most cases, we already have a house that we live in. There's already infrastructure built. There's already trees even planted along the street that we live on. The road is paved, That's all there, and we start from that point. You talk about permaculture, and there's kind of this mythic, perfect scenario that never really exists.
In this picture, we see roofs mean water catchment. There's water, and there are light levels of varying quantity in the landscape. More in more in those sunny spaces, less under trees or on north sides of the buildings. Airflow, movement of birds and animals. That's all happening here already.
And also, I really like that statement that you made, Milton, that most of the decisions have already been made for you, because to some extent that's where you would really look at that's playing right into what we call the scale of permanence as to where you're going to intervene in that system for maximum effect. There's a lot of things that are already in place, so you're going to work beneath that and around that to try to achieve your design goals.
And besides the physical ecosystem, are all these. It points to all these invisible structures that are not necessarily a part of the local ecosystem but shape it. Things like zoning laws or homeowner associations.
Absolutely.
So here I want to talk about one of the core tenets of permaculture is observation. And this instance, we have some chickens in a garden, which most people would tell you never let your chickens go at the garden because they'll tear stuff apart. But this person observed what the chickens went after, what they ate, what they didn't eat, and planted a specific garden that the chickens could be allowed into, and therefore use their energy, use their chickenness in that particular garden.
Right. So, and that's desirable because an animal, its main function in an ecosystem is to build up fertility and move, by eating and then pooping, moving that fertility around the garden. And then the chickens, of course, add other benefits because of their natural behaviors. So working with nature there.
And adding into that same observation, it's the time component is also a consideration. When would you let your chickens into your garden? So you're going to want to make sure that your plants have grown to a sufficient space, or sufficient height and strength that they can tolerate chickens running around and doing their business in there as well.
And for maybe a certain length of time. Mm-hmm. A week or 2 weeks or something like that.
This next slide, I'd really like to just bring up the concept of succession. We humans seem to have this very static notion of the world around us, and that's completely untrue. If we leave a space alone for long enough, the ecosystem will start to take over, and it will proceed along a somewhat predetermined path, depending upon what's available. This is a vacant lot in Philadelphia, and here come the trees.
And a lot of these, if we looked at the plant communities in here, some of those might be weeds, what we consider weeds, and their reason for coming in there, their reason that they succeed so well as a pioneer plant, is that they are doing repair work for the soil and building soil and modifying the microclimate so that other plants can establish themselves. The seeds can germinate, there's enough moisture retained, and so on. And that's how succession gets started in a disturbed landscape.
And I'd say that goes all the way through to our own interventions in the process. A lot of the times, if we get what we might think of as a pest in our system, if we just wait it out, often by the next season, the predator that eats that pest will show up, and on it goes.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the next slide, when we're observing an ecosystem, it's really important to notice what are the dominant species that you see, and on what scale. In these 4 pictures, I would say that the dominant species is still human, although the upper right-hand corner, you might say that the trees perhaps are dominant, but the corn in the lower left is a result of humans. All the houses in the lower right are a pretty sure sign of humans, and the city is a completely obliterated ecosystem, all in the name of humans.
I'm still pondering this.
I mean, this is a great slide because it does show the dominance of the human species intervention on the planet, and just how impactful we are. And yet I look at each of these and think, oh, well, if we know which species to bring in and alter it, what is important in each of these natural ecosystems to start shifting it, that's where I want to start as a designer. So there's a concept of keystone species, of identifying those species that sort of tend to help organize an area, like beaver in a wetland. Using those species or an analogous component to do the same function can really shift and alter and repair and regenerate a landscape.
And yet in these highly dysfunctional urban landscapes, we are the keystone species there. So it really boils down to design and our intervention in there to try to begin to replicate natural systems and bring these things back into function.
How can we function, right, as the species caring for the landscape?
Exactly.
Do we currently function in the landscape?
Good question. Maybe not in a positive or conscious way.
Right.
Yeah.
So when entering into a relationship with any landscape, I think it's really important to see the patterns that exist there that indicate what may have happened before, and understand their both their causes and their effects. This example, this is a industrial waste area, was paved, maybe there's some buildings, there's railroads there. What might you need to be aware of about this space if you're going to start that interaction with it? In Chicago, often places like this are associated with high levels of lead, and arsenic is another concern. And so knowing that in this instance would be pretty important for you decide to maybe grow vegetables there, or have chickens or whatever you decide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not having seen this picture before, it screams post-industrial.
Mm-hmm.
Almost certainly you can begin to question toxicity levels. Obviously, there's a significant amount of moisture available, and light is not an issue. When you start looking at the plant species and communities, and the grasses in the foreground and young trees, when you start to know what species they are, you start thinking, are they indicators of water? Is there a water issue here, or a high water table? What resources are on hand? Looking at the trees in the background, you start to begin to be able to age, besides identifying species, being able to tell the age of a tree. So guessing the timeline of the story, pulling out clues and pieces of the ecosystem and the story of humans on that landscape and the management decisions they made over time.
And then bringing it back, you always want to ask the question, as Milton was saying, what was there before? And by knowing what was there before, that can give you a fair indication of what wants to be there, which in this neck of the woods is primarily bur oak, savanna, and prairie grasslands. So for the most part, once you know what naturally occurs there, you can figure out what plant communities work and make your design decisions based on that.
So this next slide, I really want to ask the question, how can you measure the health of your local ecosystem? And how do you know that something is good or bad? I mean, what does that even mean? This is mountain pine beetle damage, the specific image. And the question is, does this actually constitute something we need to intervene in? What are the 100-year consequences going to be of intervening or not? And the 1,000-year consequences? How are we going to interact with this? And I have seen some studies that the damage that's being done is actually a selection process kind of preparing these ecosystems for warmer temperatures.
Well, for this one, I would say that it is a very human thing to think that we need to intervene in everything, and we do tend to want to stick our hand in everything, being the masters of the universe that we are. However, it is important to consider the cost of doing nothing, and as Milton was saying, think about what it's going to look like later if we don't intervene. Perhaps it's just an adjustment that the system is making on its own, and it doesn't necessarily need us to intervene.
This next slide, I just want to think for a moment about energy flows, and really the ultimate source of energy that we're dependent upon is the sun. If you think about oil and fossil fuels, those are all sunlight at some point. And even if you really stretch it a little bit, but even nuclear was forged in a star and is the result of being in a sun, right? So to be mindful of what is the actual amount of energy that we have available to us, where does it come from? Can we live on a solar budget of current sunlight? Is that possible?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, those are some of our real limits, right? The growth and abundance of a permaculture system often comes from being able to take advantage of what is available.
And not asking more of it than is reasonable. And in a lot of cases, people will say, well, how come we can't power this, or how come we can't get this much use out of it? And it's not that the sun is not providing abundant energy. It's just that we're asking more of it than is necessary in many cases. So we're not living within the limits. We're trying to extend beyond that to points that are just not sustainable.
One of our aims as designers is to move toward a mature system, but not an entirely mature system, because we tend to have a little bit of a loss of diversity at that point. So instead of starting out with a monoculture and having to put a lot of energy into keeping it, mowing the lawn as a monoculture, we want to intervene in very small ways in a mature, diverse system, so that we're minimizing our effort and we're getting maximum yields from a system.
This last slide, I just want to emphasize feedback loops. knowing where they are and where we can add them to make the world that we interact with work better.
So just like a mature ecosystem will very carefully take advantage of every bit of energy flowing through it, a mature system also has these tight feedback loops that carefully conserve the materials present in the system. And a sign of a healthy system is that those tight feedback loops are present and that the energy is conserved and used appropriately. And so because it's conservative in that truly conservative way, the system is able to build and generate and diversify.
I think the point of this whole presentation is really to think about what exists out there and what is really there for us to interact with. We really have the tendency to glorify ourselves. We have the tendency to be the extent of our universe. And there's a lot of life out there beyond what we're used to considering. The more that you can sync with the rhythms of your local ecosystem, the better.